Welcome to How to Get on a Watchlist, the new podcast series from Encyclopedia Geopolitica. In each episode, we'll sit down with leading experts to discuss dangerous activities. From assassinations and airliner shootdowns through to kidnappings and coups, we'll examine each of these threats through the lenses of both the dangerous actors seeking to conduct these operations and the agencies around the world seeking to stop them.
In the interest of operational security, certain tactical details will be omitted from these discussions. However, the cases and threats which we discuss here are very real.
I'm Louis H. the founder and co-editor of Encyclopedia Geopolitica. I'm a researcher in the field of intelligence and espionage with a PhD in intelligence studies from Loughborough University. I'm an adjunct professor in intelligence at Sciences Po Paris, and in my day job, I provide geopolitical analysis and security-focused intelligence to private sector corporations.
My name is Colin Reed. I am a former U.S. intelligence professional now working in the private sector to bring geopolitical insights and risk analysis to business leaders.
So today we're discussing how to steal an election, and for this we're joined by an excellent guest. Nicolás Prados is a project lead at Southern Pulse, focusing mainly on political risk and organized crime. Originally from Spain, he's worked for a number of years in Mexico before obtaining a DPhil in history and an MPhil in Latin American studies from the University of Oxford. Prior to joining Southern Pulse, he taught Latin American history at University College London and at the University of Oxford, and collaborated with a number of media outlets from Spain, Mexico, and Colombia. His academic and professional interests focus on the challenges of establishing democracies in unstable contexts. So, Nicolás, this is an interesting topic with an interesting background. The question we always ask our guests at the start is, how did you get into this line of work?
Well, thanks, Louis and Colin, for having me. Well, I began sort of my interest in Latin America when I was in university. Being Spanish, I thought Latin America was a very interesting sort of mirror or distorted mirror image to Spain. We kind of came from very similar roots if you begin from independence onward. So I always had a fascination that then after university, I moved to Mexico where I did kind of different sort of odd jobs. So I worked at a TV station, I worked at a documentary production company, I worked a bit as a journalist as well. So I was doing different things until eventually I found my way to Oxford to try to give some sort of academic coherence to the things I was interested in. And it was when I was finishing my DPhil that I started working part-time with Southern Pulse, sort of using my kind of historical knowledge to present day issues, which I found to be very exciting because from a very sort of obvious but very interesting perspective, the sort of scale of the issues you're looking at completely changes from looking at something that is historically and therefore inherently over versus looking at problems that are developing and ongoing and you don't know how they're going to end. So that has really sort of fascinated me in the past couple of years. And I moved from being part-time, finished my DPhil, and then I took on a full-time position as projects lead at Southern Pulse, where we provide strategic advisory to companies working in Latin America. So we look a lot at the challenges posed by different political actors, organized crime, informal actors, etc.
All right, so let's talk about stealing elections. You seem like the man for the job. When we're going to steal an election, it seems like there's some kind of covert, clandestine ways we can go about this. And then there's also sort of more open legal ways we can manipulate the legal system to do this. What, in your experience, typically is more common? And is there a more effective way of doing this? Is one better than the other?
The way I think about it, sort of using the distinction between clandestine and sort of legal ways, is there are basically three moments in which you can steal an election. So you can start with the earliest moment possible, which is by just designing the system in a way that's convenient to you. So that way you can start to sort of alter the rules of the game before the election has even taken place. That's sort of moment number one. Then you have a second moment, which is election day itself, which is when people actually have to go to the the ballot box and like insert their ballot. And then there's a final moment, which is after the election has happened. So you can still tamper with the result once people have voted and you're either counting or I can give some examples later where even after the votes have been counted, you can still sort of change the outcome. So I think if I was doing the stealing, the easiest, the best way, the most effective way is the first moment, is to change the rules of the game in a way that benefits you before anyone has even gone to the ballot box. But for the same reason, it's the hardest. It involves having a big degree, like a massive amount of control over, on the one hand, the legislative, just because it's the place where you're going to be regulating how the electoral system works, but also the judiciary, because you are not working in a vacuum. You're probably working in a country which has a constitution, and you're going to do things that change the constitution, and you're going to need the judiciary on your hand, on your side. And then perhaps most importantly, after you've managed to sort of wrangle parliament and the judiciary, you need the power to actually enforce whatever it is you're trying to do. So that's usually when the army and the police become quite useful allies. I think it depends what kind of regime you are and which situation is more prevalent. I think usually stealing the election at the first moment is kind of plan A by a lot of regimes, but because it involves so many actors, it's a lot of these regimes are unable to complete it. So then stealing it in the second moment is a bit plan B. And then having to tamper with the votes after they've been cast, that's really the emergency button, like completely panicking moment. Let's try to fix this after it's been decided.
Are there any cases of election stealing that you would say are the kind of go-to case examples, the case studies that you would point to and say this is what those three moments look like?
I think Venezuela, for example, in the past 20 years offers like a very neat progression from a regime that was very skilled at rigging the system in sort of moment one before the ballots have been casted, to moving all the way to having to steal the election in point number 3, which is what we saw in July. And so I'll give some examples of how this has happened, and other regimes can sort of imitate each other. I guess how to steal it on phase 1, kind of, I covered in the previous answer, so I guess that's more we're more familiar with. When it comes to stealing the election on election day itself, the Venezuelan regime, for example, they resorted to all sorts of very kind of clever and indirect ways of doing it. So perhaps the most blunt way was just to deploy the military to voting centers. So you have to cast your ballot in front of soldiers with weapons, which usually can be a bit intimidatory, especially if the soldiers are supporting the regime that is telling you to vote for them and not for anyone else. But you can also mess with where the voting centers themselves are. So, for example, you can reduce the number of voting centers in neighborhoods that you consider to be leaning towards the opposition, and devote more resources to setting up voting centers where your sort of loyalists are living in. You can do something which they did in Venezuela quite often, which is to extend the voting hours of voting centers where your loyalists are, and close early the voting centers in neighborhoods of people that you think are not voting for you. So there's all sorts of small ways you can tamper election day to make sure that you're getting ahead. And then finally, if everything has gone wrong, you've been unable to rig the system, you've been unable to intimidate voters, sometimes just easily by pure violence. That also happens. Just voters are beaten up or killed in some cases. So if all of that has failed and still people have been brave enough to go cast their ballot for the opposing party, you can do two things after that has happened. One is to just completely ignore the result and come up with your own number, which is what the Venezuelan regime did in July for the first time almost ever in a presidential election, which was to just completely ignore whatever was put in those boxes and say, well, actually, we won 55% to 45, and that's it. Just going to have to believe me. Or there is a more sort of insidious and like a bit more of a diabolical way of winning after losing, if that makes sense, which is you remove the power of the position that has just been elected. So this is something that they did with the mayoralty of Caracas. I want to say in 2015, but I could be wrong, where an opposition leader won the election to be mayor of Caracas, and the government could not tamper with the votes after they had been counted. So what they chose to do instead was to take all of the powers of the position and transfer them to a different office which they controlled. So at the presidential level, for example, this could be that an opposition leader wins the election, he becomes president, but then before he takes office, you just decide that executive power actually is going to rest now with the prime minister. And now we're going to, we decided in the last minute to change our system, and actually the president is now a ceremonial role. So you thought you were running for one position and we just changed it. So I guess that is a way that that the Venezuelan regime has sort of set examples that can be followed. And I'm sort of limiting myself to Latin America because it's what I know best, but I'm sure that there are examples in other parts of the world that follow similar ideas. I mean, that's the interesting thing about these tactics or strategies. They're easy to imitate. They kind of catch on. Once you see someone successfully employing them, it doesn't take a lot for an advisor to tell a ruler, like, well, why don't we do what they just did in X country that we just saw? And so it's a very kind of sort of cosmopolitan exchange of ideas when it comes to stealing elections.
So you mentioned there's a sort of shared awareness of how this goes down. Are there sort of common markers that one can look out for in a country, in a society, that might indicate that it's ripe for this kind of election stealing? Are there political, societal, economic, other preconditions you can look for and say, this might be an indicator that this society is ripe for, an illegitimate election shenanigans?
Yeah, I think there are several. The problem is that some are very tricky to read as either benign or leading towards this kind of election stealing. And what I mean by that is that I would say one of the indications or one of the indicators would be having a regime or a government that is incredibly popular. And that is counterintuitive because you would assume that a popular government is just good. But at the same time, once you have a regime that's popular enough to have super majorities in legislative chambers, or basically countries have different laws, but they all essentially allow for modifications of the constitution, of the playbook, if you have a majority that's big enough. So if you manage to be so successful that you have that majority, then you can change the rules of the game before the election comes. So having a wildly popular government is sort of eerily an indicator, because it's both good, but it could also be turned towards this kind of more authoritarian means. I guess the more an easier indicator would be when a regime starts trying to take control over the judiciary. I guess struggles over control of the judiciary, or what's usually called sort of the politicization of the judiciary, that's a bit the smoking gun for election interference, because usually dominating the judiciary is part of a broader plan, or rather is part of a broader vision of the state, whereby you think that you in the executive should control all of the levers of the state for whatever end in your mind justifies this. So I think that reveals an idea in the executive that leads to election stealing. Because I guess one of the interesting questions about election fraud is, why would you commit it beyond the obvious answer of, well, just because I want power? Usually there is an idea behind it, which is whatever it is I'm doing in power, it's too valuable to disappear, or it's too valuable to let the other team take it. there's usually that kind of mentality behind stealing an election. Whereas in democratic countries where elections tend to be regularly fair, it all hinges on whoever is going to lose or whoever is in power thinking, whatever my project is, it's fine without me. The country can survive without me. Whereas where you have these leaders that see themselves as, either the salvation of the country or the project that they want to enact, it's too big to allow anyone else to derail it. And that's when this whole chain of little dominoes begins until rigging an election, because your starting point is the idea that you're doing something too vast to be allowed to be overthrown, in a whim because voters just decide something else.
What about the role of the military and the security services? Anytime we see a sort of contested political changes, often people will look at, who are the military forces lining up behind, obviously that we're recording this in the week of the attempted martial law incident in South Korea. Whether the military would follow that order or not was one of the big indicators everyone was looking at. So how much does that matter in stealing an election?
I think the military is crucial for any kind of attempt of this kind, because it's a bit what I was saying at the beginning when it comes to co-opting the judiciary. That gives you control of the rule book, but then you need to make sure you have the power to enforce your new rule book. And that's where both the military and the police are crucial, because it's not a very good situation if you have the backing of one armed body in your country, but not the other. Ideally, you want everyone with a weapon to be with you. You don't want them to be divided, because then you can descend into civil war. So the military is inherently crucial to any of these attempts. And I think that's one of the miscalculations that a lot of presidents end up committing, which is that they think they have enough backing from the armed forces to do their coup, or to just more plainly rig an election, and then find out the hard way that actually they don't have enough support. And I think that the case of South Korea is interesting in this context, or we saw it in Peru in, I think it was December of 22, and it's very similarly that the president decided to enact martial law, close down Congress, and the military just refused to follow him. Similarly, there's been a lot of revelations in the past couple of weeks in Brazil over Jair Bolsonaro's attempt to sort of avoid the handover of power to Lula, which I think was also in 22, but I could be wrong. Basically, Bolsonaro thinking that he would count with enough support within the military to carry out his plans to stop Lula from becoming president, and he found out that he didn't have support of the military. So I think on the one hand, a lot of these efforts hinge on support of the military, but then we should also be careful and understand that the military is not a single monolithic political actor, at least in this kind of political sense, but is usually divided in half between sort of high-ranking officials or officers and the troops and the lower level officers. And that divide within the military is key to understanding how regimes can use the armed forces to execute their goals, because there's not much use in having the support of all the generals if the soldiers in the barracks are not with you. And usually rulers tend to be successful when they manage to have the troops in the barracks supporting them. You can even get away with bypassing sort of the officer class of the army, because usually, historically, sort of the majority of times, but not always, military officers side with their soldiers out of fear of being overthrown from their positions. Because again, we're talking about a lot of men with guns, so the stakes are very high when it comes to this kind of power plays. So yeah, overall, the military is key in any time in any of these attempts.
So you're talking a lot about, the role of the common soldiers, the role of fear and sort of the might of the masses there. I'm wondering about sort of the role of the street, right? Popular demonstrations, mass street movements. We've seen, stormings of political buildings. What about that aspect? How much of that is necessary to cement, a contested political change or an illegitimate sort of person coming to power?
It sort of goes hand in hand with the question of the military. Just because usually mass protests when the army is actively crushing them, it's very difficult to succeed. No, I mean, I think there is a limited amount of things normal civilians that are unarmed can do when going up against military forces. And I guess in a way we saw this during the sort of democratic spring in the Middle East, where there is just a limit to how much ordinary people can do when faced with against soldiers. No, I mean, at the end of the day, you are unarmed and they have weapons, so I guess they win. Having said that, what can be crucial is if the armed forces in general, if they decide to stand by, if they decide not to take any position, if they decide to just sort of sit and watch, then and people are allowed to protest without being shot at, that is a hugely important element, because that can decide the momentum of your movement, that can just, in a more practical sense, actively sabotage either the counting of the ballots or any other process of the sort of electoral chain that you're trying to disrupt or you're trying to shape towards your own means. So in general, if the armed forces are out of the playing field, then being able to put people on the street, it's hugely advantageous.
What about the elites then? What about the oligarchy, the wealthiest members of society? You often hear about elite defections at a critical moment for a regime. What's their role in this?
That's a good question. I guess it would depend what kind of elites they are. If they're political elites, economic elites, I would imagine economic elites, they have sway, of course, over any government because they have resources, they have control over usually either business or media, so they have an important say over what is going to happen, where are events going to turn to. Same thing with the political elite. When you are trying to undertake any of these kind of mass frauds, because you need such a large coordination of actors from the judiciary to just grassroots support in voting centers, that you need to make sure whoever is in your coalition is supporting you. So if you have political elites at the regional level or at the national level that are sort of selling their support very expensively to you, you're going to have to still bring them on board, because you cannot do this with a fractured coalition. So I think elites play a role in deciding whether they're going to join the team overthrowing the government or rigging the election, or if they're going to try to stop it. It's a bit of an unsatisfying answer, but I see their role as kind of diffused throughout the whole chain. They kind of take different positions along the whole process of going from designing the system to altering the votes once they've been casted.
All right, so you're a Latin America specialist. We know that's a region where there's been a lot of this kind of political turmoil to some degree over the past few decades. Are there other places in the world or other systems of democracy, where you think electoral fraud happens sort of more frequently, less frequently? And wearing that sort of Latin America hat, are there places even sort of within that region that you think are more prone to this kind of thing than other places?
I guess to give kind of a more interesting answer, although perhaps less accurate, I think any democratic system is vulnerable to this, and not necessarily prone, as in it tends to happen all the time. It could happen at any moment. It's institutions are very fragile in the sense that they're up for debate. And as I was mentioning earlier, the sort of first stage, or one of the first stages you need to start tampering with the system, is to have huge popularity and have a big following. So any country that allows for that, you are already allowing the possibility of this thing to happen. Because the sort of easy answer would be that there is this propensity in countries that are, their institutions are more vulnerable, or the institutions are newer. But I think that is slightly misleading, because we've seen what's happened in the US for almost a decade now, where things that people thought were unthinkable, or people thought that were, this sort of attitude of like, this doesn't happen here, this happens in other places, that's completely been shattered, because the realization is that if you're stealing the election in the point of design, if you are trying to change the playbook, at the end of the day, that's a political question. That's a question of that belongs to in legislatives, that belongs in constitutional assemblies. That's a question of, well, how do we decide to organize ourselves? And wherever you have a democratic system, or a system with a legislative chamber, and at least a notional allegiance to popular sovereignty, that question is allowed to be asked. So any system that allows you to ask the question, well, why are we voting for the president the way we are? Why don't we change this? Why don't we organize this in a different way? That allows you to change it towards almost any possible type of system. I mean, it's not easy to come up with, to turn that into a sort of North Korea, but you can. And I think in that sense, there is no democratic country free from the possibility of someone eventually building up the capability of tampering with the whole political system to their advantage.
I'm glad you've kind of brought us onto that topic, the political economy angle on this. I want to dive into your background a little bit. You mentioned you'd worked in Mexico, and I'm thinking about the high level of political violence that we see surrounding elections in Mexico. So they're stealing elections by sort of modifying the political process for those elections, but then there's also this element where just exposing the public to intimidation and fear can have an impact on elections, even if the process itself is sort of on paper being carried out the way that it's supposed to be, right? How does one even sort of measure the political legitimacy of an election in a climate where there is violence and intimidation?
It's very, very, very difficult. I think that the case of Mexico is interesting because, as you're pointing out, there is this massive amount of violence in the whole process leading up to the election day, and sometimes even going after election day, which is where usually organized crime groups, because they need the protection of local government, they want to make sure that whoever is elected is their guy. And usually the way you get your guy elected is, the easy way is you just spend lots of money in busing people to the voting centers and just getting them to vote for your guy. That's the non-violent way, which happens a lot in rural Mexico. And then the violent way is just killing the guy who's leading in the polls and happens to be of the party you're not supporting. In which case, you have a kind of patchwork of democratic legitimacy where overall, you can say it's broadly, overall it's legitimate because this happens in less places than, the average. It's not in the majority of places. But then you do have municipalities where whoever was elected was chosen by unaccountable people, and it's completely illegitimate. There's also a sort of bigger question when it comes to the legitimacy of regimes coming from elections, which is, and this is something that it's I can't help but adding it just because it comes from my kind of more historical background, which is the purpose we ascribe to elections has changed from sort of, say, the 19th century to now. And I think the interesting thing about this is that if it's changed in the past, it could change in the future. So what I mean is that now we understand elections as to be the crucial moment where we choose as individuals who we think should rule us. And it's kind of common sense everywhere. But 100, 200 years ago, I mean, if we go back to the 19th century, elections had a completely different purpose. They were not about choosing who we think is going to rule us, but it was about sort of making a statement as society, or as a, in the case of a town or a village, as a community, that political choices were being taken not by the aristocrats or the elite, but by commoners. So the purpose of elections was sort of more similar to a carnival or some sort of festival, where it wasn't so much about you choosing an option, but it was just by the act of showing up and casting a ballot that you were showing that in this town, elections are not taken by the local lord or the local priest, but by regular people. So then in those elections, it didn't really matter whether, if illiterate men could vote, if you had to be a certain age, because it wasn't about who was actually doing the voting. It was about who were the people in the street in this whole parade festivity of the election sort of taking place. And then the purpose in that election is to certify that not the nobles, but the commoners are the ones sort of calling the shots. To tie this back to Mexico, I mean, Mexico has a long history where the point of elections was not to choose a ruling party, because between 1929 and the year 2000, there was only one ruling party. But it was opening the door to, okay, within the ruling party, which faction should be the one leading this? There was a lot of jockeying for positions that, usually didn't happen at the point of the ballot box, but they still subjected themselves to elections to show that I can still pull in enough people, either by giving them money or whatever, that I have certain degree of legitimacy. So it was a sort of way of stamping whoever was chosen, and behind closed doors, as saying, I'm the guy that can still mobilize enough and sort of bribe enough people in towns across the whole of Mexico to come on election day and say, yes, this guy. The elections during the Mexican 20th century, they were a way of the incumbent saying, I still have enough pull over most of the population to be able to carry this out. So the election was a bit of a certification of something that had already happened. And that could be where we move in the future. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if the purpose of the elections in places like Mexico or in other places were to change in the future. And they're not so much about choosing one guy over the other, but they take different purposes. And that can be a bit scary, but I am sure if we explained how our politics works to someone in the year 1810, maybe they would also be horrified. So some of it is, I guess, adapting to the times.
So what about the other side of this then? We're talking about this idea of trying to shape elections through the use of fear and sticks. What about through the use of carrots? Where we see people seeking election or re-election, distributing gifts, food, money in some cases, and with the intent to buy votes. A lot of countries have guardrails in place around this, but some don't. And what about those countries where it just happens anyway?
Yeah, I mean, that's such a key part of manipulating elections, which I find it's something very tricky to regulate, because the line between open bribery and eventually just self-interest, it's hard to choose a cutting point where bribery becomes just someone choosing what's best for themselves. And that raises a whole lot of questions as you make that journey. Usually clientelism and the ability to mobilize local leaders, because that's something interesting thing about elections. Just because they happen at the local level, they involve someone in high office having to deal with people in sometimes very remote towns. It does mean that you have to provide something to all those people that are promising to support you. And I think you're right, Lewis, in having to sort of differentiate or provide the guardrails for what is an acceptable kind of gift or token. So, you can promise we are fine with a presidential candidate telling a mayor, like, listen, if you get the local party to vote for me, or if you get your followers to vote for me, I'll build you a bridge. I mean, that we're fine with. If you say, if you get your people to vote for me, I'll give away bags of rice to your village, then that, we're fine, but it's starting to look a bit not ideal. And then if you say, forget the rice, I'll just give them, I don't know, $100 to each, then that's where we say, okay, no, enough. That's no longer allowed. It's a hard line to draw, because it's a very political line. It's a political question of how are we going to organize the way we do elections? What's the way we are happy with in terms of guaranteeing that our elections are free and fair? And some people would say that, well, we need to sort of depoliticize this as much as possible, like try to, rely on autonomous institutions, right? Bodies that are not elected. We need to try to take pieces of this electoral chain and put them somewhere safe where, no one can tamper with them. And then others would say, well, that's not democratic. The whole point of elections is that the people decide. So, that whole change should be subjected to whatever people want to do with it. Both extremes end up leading to very anti-democratic results. If you have an electoral system that is completely out of touch and devoid from any human contact, then it just loses the kind of demos part of democracy. But on the other hand, if it's perfectly fraudulent and completely co-opted by corruption and a political party, then choice is meaningless. So then you also have lost your democracy. So it's a very fine line to draw.
So I'm glad you're bringing up this idea of, change over time and how we regard elections. I wanted to ask you about technological advances. What are your thoughts on sort of the role that social media is playing in stealing elections nowadays? Are there places in the world that you can think of where maybe the social media angle isn't mattering as much as it is to those of us sort of in the West right now?
Yeah, this is something that I think quite often. I mean, I sort of change my opinion from one day to the next on how I feel about social media and elections, because sometimes I feel like the impact of social media is completely overblown and it's completely sort of disproportionate how much power we ascribe to just, I don't know, TikTok ads being able to convince someone to change their mind. But then at the same time, it's such a huge technological revolution that it cannot be underestimated and it cannot be overlooked. And I find it hard to sort of wrap my head around it, because I can see some effects in the aftermath of sort of social media increasing its popularity among people. So you can see that, we have a much more political fragmentation now when it comes to national politics across most of the world. I mean, just to pick Europe, we have so many coalition governments or minority governments in places where they were the exception. I'm saying just this because coming from Spain, now coalition governments have been in power for a while and they were completely new to our political system. And I think it's very tempting, and I think it's sort of true initially, but one has to be careful to link those new developments to, it's just social media dividing people. Because I think inevitably it does. I think the impact of technology is so massive over our politics and our communication that it's hard to put bounds to it and kind of compare it with something else. So just speaking about something like the internet and how the internet is structured towards engaging people at an individual level, and how does that correlate then with the political choices they make? I mean, those are very vast questions that require very difficult and sophisticated work. At a more easier kind of ground level of politics, I think we can see how technology has made coordination, for example, much easier, much faster. So this was kind of the lesson again of the Arab Spring of the 2010s, where suddenly you could mobilize people much faster than before. It has also made the question of regulating sort of public discourse trickier for regimes, because you can control the press, you can shut down a TV station, but it's much harder to shut down a website, for example, that's hosted in a third country. That doesn't mean that there are not a lot of countries trying it and sort of succeeding. So, in Cuba, for example, the internet goes down when it's convenient for their government because there's some crisis developing. So the governments are slowly coming to terms with how to regulate social media and the internet. But I think overall, it's kind of the question maybe of our lifetimes. How is social media and technology shaping politics? I mean, I don't know how long it took people in the 20th century to kind of pin down how newspapers were affecting what they were seeing. I mean, for one, it's taking me a while, so I'm not there yet. I think it's going to take me more time.
You're listening to How to Steal an Election with Nicolás Prados. After the break, we'll talk about saving democracy from election stealers.
You have been listening to How to Get on a Watchlist, the podcast series from Encyclopedia Geopolitica. If you like this show, don't forget to check out our other content at Encyclopedia Geopolitica, which you can find at howtogetonawatchlist.com, where you can find our analysis on various geopolitical issues, as well as reading lists covering topics like those discussed in the podcast. Please also consider subscribing to the podcast on your streaming platform of choice, giving us a rating, and joining our Patreon.
So, given all the different ways that a bad actor could steal an election, let's kick this off. How can a society prevent an election from being stolen? What are the kind of key things a society, a government can put in place as guardrails around this kind of threat?
I think if we go back to the kind of three moments where you can steal an election, I'm sort of confident that, in general, humanity, just to be very broad, we've become fairly adept at stopping elections from being stolen in points 2 and 3. So on the day of the election and then in the counting of the election. We have, in general, there's lots of very good legislation around the world that then, politicians and legislators can copy from each other around how to ensuring, for example, that the institution in charge of overseeing elections is autonomous from much of the state, and there's a lot of sort of fine-tuning how to elect the members of those institutions so that it's connected to politics and therefore democratic, but at the same time detached enough that it's not partisan. And I feel like in a lot of countries we've reached a pretty good balance. There's also very solid laws and rules around what is permissible to do on election day, what isn't. All sorts of legislation around, the presence of armed civilians or even members of the military being present at ballot boxes, at voting places. And there's also a very sort of advanced technology in those countries where they use voting machines that goes into how to completely shield the machine from being tampered with, how to ensure that whatever the machine captures is that then faithfully brought back to the sort of central HQ where the votes are being counted. Same thing with paper ballots. I mean, you have countries where by now perhaps 100 years of experience and practice at counting ballots, making sure that they're not tampered with, coming up with a very solid line of security from the citizen casting the little paper to them being tallied towards the total amount. So when it comes to points 2 and 3, I think we're good, generally speaking. The problem is, how do you avoid point 1, which is when it comes to designing the political system? And I feel like that's a question that, broadly speaking, to say sort of Western countries have not asked themselves in a while. And I feel it's something that is catching them unprepared. And I see this with a lot of the discourse around populism and the rise of populism, the kind of shock effect of populism where people or political commentators, politicians see something unusual happen. To me, something interesting about that reaction is the whole aspect of it being surprising, being unexpected, being something that it's not supposed to happen, because it's coming from a direction that they were not expecting it to come from. And I guess I see this a bit as part of the kind of broader political ideological sort of movement from the 90s towards the present, where the way we characterize the 90s or the 2000s, it's very common to just use Fukuyama's end of history phrase, and then people argue over, well, history wasn't over. And there's a lot of bickering over the point of Fukuyama sort of identified that the conflict between ideologies was over because one had won. And all of the ensuing argument has focused around, well, actually, that's not true because you have China, you have Russia. But what I think is interesting is that I think maybe we should devote more attention to the point of, well, why are we so certain that our ideological system, or whatever our is supposed to mean, but that, what he calls liberal democracy, why are we so certain that that question of what that is over? Why are we so certain that, the model of liberal democracy was locked in place in 1991, never to change again? Because anyone who has studied the history of democracy knows that that's not how it works. Democracy depends on people. People change. So liberal democracy, it's going to change. So I think you have to be open to the possibility that the purpose of elections, the purpose of democracy, the way it's supposed to work, it's going to be asked. Someone is going to ask, well, why are we doing this the way we're doing? And you have to have an answer. And I think that's where personally, as a citizen almost, I would like to see a bit more attention to, which is, well, what are our convincing reasons for doing things the way they're done? So I think that's the key kind of critical, difficult question to answer. I feel like the technical elements of election day and then counting votes, I think we're very good at that. I think it's more the tougher and more abstract question of, well, why do we do things the way we do? Which needs more elaborating.
So we'll take you back to the slightly more technical, as interesting as that stuff is. Let's say we've had an election take place. It appears that there was some kind of electoral fraud. We have rule of law defenders in place. How do we convince people, bodies politic, that what they're doing is democratic and derives legitimacy from the process, right? So maybe we take it in that direction. Maybe you answer sort of, how does a rule of law defender prove that there was illegitimacy that took place, and how do you reestablish legitimacy in the process? Restore trust, I guess, in a process. That might be an interesting way to answer.
It's an interesting question because I think a lot of it hinges on, for example, whether you have evidence. Because evidence by nature can be very powerful, although to your point earlier, Colin, on technology, evidence can also be forged, or people can be distrustful of evidence because you can say, anything can be photoshopped, or that could be AI. So, but overall, common sense tends to prevail, or at least I'm sort of naive enough to think that. So if the evidence is very blatant, you kind of tend to get enough sort of momentum behind you. But I guess more broadly, the answer to that question is, again, political, and do you have enough support from enough people to back your argument or to back your claim, which can be very frustrating when you have a claim that is backed by evidence and you're having to compete on equal terms with someone who isn't. But, unfortunately, that's just the reality of politics. It's not fair inherently. We just have to try to make it fair, and we don't always succeed. So I think at the end of the day, the only way you can restore trust is if you manage to bring enough of a coalition behind you that it kind of group the vast majority of the body politic. And we've seen this in sort of democratic transitions in different countries, where the sort of most effective way of inaugurating a new democratic regime is to get as much breadth as possible of the sort of political arc to be supportive of the new regime, no matter how ideologically diverse. I mean, that's usually because at the end of the day, the game is democracy. The more people you have, the better it's going to go for you. Like, the more, numbers win at the end of the day. So if you have a very broad coalition, you will be able to restore legitimacy, which again, it's very frustrating in cases where you have evidence and you can say that you are objectively right. But if you lack that support, that popular support, if you lack the ability to communicate it, then no matter how right you are, it's just not going to happen. I mean, I guess in some way, El Salvador is an interesting case of this, where it's pretty blatant what Nayib Bukele, the president, has done to cement himself in power, and how much he has disregarded all sorts of laws. But at the end of the day, his coalition is still larger and more powerful than anyone else trying to topple him, regardless of, and we all know he's not sort of, he's breaking laws, he's doing all sorts of illegal things, but it eventually comes down to whether you have enough support across society to enforce that kind of claim to legitimacy you're raising.
What about outside of society then? If you're unable to get support from within the society, are there international bodies that can rule and enforce on election legitimacy?
Yeah, I think it's the question of how can the international community sort of prevent or bring about the downfall of an authoritarian regime is one of the key questions on these conversations, because I feel like there's sort of a pendulum that goes from we can make, the international community can overthrow any dictatorship and we're very optimistic and we can turn any country we want into a democracy, to the opposite side of the pendulum, which is, well, it's not our business whether someone is, killing vast percentage of their population and we're just going to trade with them no matter what, because at the end of the day, it's not our say. Now, so you have those two extremes. And I think what I have found in kind of my own research and what I kind of tentatively guide myself by is that the international community is not very good at bringing about regime change. So they're not usually very successful at overthrowing a dictator to impose a democracy, but they are much more successful at defending an existing democracy. So I think the international community in general can actually make a vast difference when it comes to both providing political and diplomatic legitimacy, but then providing sort of material means for a democracy to defend itself. We can see this from a state of war, like we can see this in Ukraine, where they've been able to successfully pour in a lot of resources into the Ukrainian military, or historically, international coalitions have been very successful in defending countries that were under threat of a coup by intervening very solidly on one side, but less so when it comes to completely overthrowing an authoritarian regime.
How does a society walk the line between ensuring that there are these adequate guardrails in place to secure an election's integrity without taking those measures too far and creating repressive conditions, which sort of are returning predestined results, and that maybe make society think that, as you've pointed out, maybe the voting itself is not actually the will of the society?
It's a tricky balance that I think we reached a sort of solution to that question from, let's say, post-World War II Europe until now, where you have this balance of having some sort of independent regulator of elections, which is independent yet still connected to Congress. Usually Congress needs a certain supermajority or a coalition of the main parties to agree who sits on this board. So we have this, I think we have kind of nailed this balance of how to have guardrails that are impartial, but also not completely detached from the will of voters. I guess the unsettling question is this going to keep holding? Is this balance going to continue to survive? Because at the end of the day, it hinges on the perception of voters as legitimate or as fair or as responsive. And opening the box of, well, okay, let's remove this guardrail we have and let's put a new one. Under the wrong conditions, it can be a very sort of scary question. So, for example, in the US, one of these guardrails that was put in the Constitution back, 200 years ago was the Electoral College. That was supposed to be a guardrail to prevent democracy from, becoming too majoritarian, sort of the tyranny of the majority. So they installed a guardrail that for a lot of people now has become obsolete, and it has to be done without because it's not responsive to people. A lot of the people who think that would be very scared if the person opening that box was Donald Trump, for example. So I think that's where we have a balance. Some people are unhappy, but the thing you have to take into account where you choose whether to open the engine and start fine tuning is, do you trust the guy who's going to, do you trust the mechanic? Do you trust the guy in power who's going to do the fine tuning? Or do you trust that you have the ability to tell the mechanic what to do? And then B, well, is it worth the risk? Do you think you're going to be better off once that has been fine tuned? Or do you think, well, actually, the mechanic right now is not my guy, so I don't trust him to rebalance this guardrail? So I think it's something we will see over the next few years, whether this sort of balance we've reached continues to hold.
So I want to tie together a lot of the things that I think you've kind of said about this narrative, right? That the democracy is in crisis now and previously was not. Is that narrative helpful, right? Does that help or does that harm us as we try to think about how we ensure legitimate democratic processes? And to your point, try to modernize those things for the world we live in now.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a bit skeptical. I mean, of this rhetoric about democracies in crisis. On the one hand, I understand where it's coming from. It's undeniable that we're living a moment of turmoil. But on the other hand, as anyone who does history, the whole thing of like, well, this is new, this is unprecedented, immediately strikes a nerve where you're like, well, actually, no, like this is actually quite common. And usually crisis is more common than stability. I mean, if you start looking for stability in the past, you realize that, well, actually, things look stable to you from the distance, but the people living it in the moment, it wasn't stable. So it's very. So I do find a bit the rhetoric about democracy in crisis. It to some extent it precludes us from a more interesting approach or a more interesting question, which is, again, to go back, which is, well, why do we do the things the way we do, and is there a better way of doing things, or is there, doesn't necessarily have to be a huge wholesale change of the way we do things, but are there improvements? Because you are reaching for improvements doesn't mean you dismiss the whole project. You know, the kind of the English expression of you don't want to throw the baby with the bathwater. Just because you want to change something doesn't mean that you think the whole thing was wrong in the first place. So I think it's kind of patent for everyone. You know, it's quite blatant that the way politics is structured in you know, much of Europe, Latin America, and I don't want to say Africa and Asia because, you know, it's not my, I don't follow those regions as much, but it's very apparent that people are dissatisfied. And I think it's more conducive to think, well, which aspects of it are not working and how should this change? I mean, and accept that democracy has to fit the people. You know, democracy goes with the people just because that's the whole nature of the game. You cannot have the people get used to your democracy. It's the other way around. So you have to accept that as people change, as technology changes, as the economy changes, those changes will then eventually reflect themselves in the ways you organize politics. And I feel like this idea of, you know, liberal democracies in crisis and everything was fine until these vandals came and broke everything down, and we just need to, you know, if only we could just go back to 1999 and everything would be great. I think that's just adding fuel to the fire. It's kind of trying to gaslight a whole population into saying, well, you think things are wrong, but you're mistaken. Things are fine. It's just you don't get it. You know, I mean, it's just you don't understand your own democracy. You don't get it. And I think that's fuel to the fire.
So what keeps you up at night? What is the nightmare scenario when it comes to democracies?
That's a good question. The nightmare scenario is reaching a point where political parties or political leaders are confident enough in saying, you know what, democracy itself is pointless. And we've had enough. And, you know, the idea of popular sovereignty, we don't believe in that anymore. That's just nonsense. What we believe in is the state. And, you know, and people come and go, but the state is forever. I think it, you know, to really comfort myself, I think that you know, when we have sort of new extremist parties, you know, the rise of the far right in Europe, I always tell myself, well, at least they're running for elections. You know, at least they still believe in the fact that people choose who their rulers are, which, you know, sounds like not a massive consolation, but we also should remember that not very long ago, I mean, in the case of Spain, just a generation ago, that wasn't the norm. You know, like a generation ago, the norm was, you know, people come and go, they die, they don't know what they want, and the state is the protagonist of the story, and you know, it's the state, the one that has to survive, and, you know, the one that's really guiding things. And, you know, popular sovereignty, that's not a thing. You know, like you read the Spanish sort of constitution, although it wasn't exactly a constitution, under the dictatorship of Francisco Franco, and then in the first page the people don't show up because they're not part of the conversation. You don't have not even any allusion, no matter how sort of fraudulent and hypocritical towards the rule of the people. That's just completely gone. And I think what would terrify me is reaching a point where someone says, we don't need people to organize our politics. We don't need humans. I mean, I guess that's something that the whole technological discussion could bring about that kind of terrifies me. The idea of, well, humans make mistakes. They make the wrong decisions. They're not very smart, or they choose the wrong guy. So let's entrust our politics to non-human entities. Like let's entrust the control of the state to non-humans. And I guess, just in a nutshell, I guess it's just the end of the idea of popular sovereignty that would terrify me.
Well, Nicolás, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Lewis and Colin. It was a pleasure.
Well, our producer for this episode was Edwin Tran. Our researchers were Alex Smith and Alexandra Shokiewicz. To all our listeners and Patreon supporters, thank you very much for listening and supporting How to Get on a Watchlist.
If you enjoyed this show, please consider checking out our other content at Encyclopedia Geopolitica. We'd also appreciate it if you could subscribe to the podcast, leave a review, or support us on Patreon. Thanks for listening.
What's your emergency?